Hi, everybody. My name is Travis True. I'm programming manager for this year's Philadelphia Film Festival. I just want to thank you for joining us for this year's fest. Hopefully, you just had a chance to catch a really wonderful film called Minyan. And we are so lucky to be joined by the co writer and director of the film, Eric Steele. So, Eric, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us tonight.
Oh, thank you.
So, I was wondering, so the film is based on a short story. I wonder if you could talk about when you first read that short story, how you sort of came to that material, and what the process was like of adapting it into the film that we have now.
So I read the short story Minyan by David Bismogus in 2004. Was actually in I was in San Francisco. I was making a documentary called The Bridge, and which was really my first time, as a I'd been a producer and I'd been an executive, but now I was or I believed myself to be a filmmaker, and so I read this story and I kind of was mesmerized by it. I can't exactly explain the feeling. Like when I read something and I say, "Oh, this is a movie," it's a little bit like um, it's some sort of chemical mind firework explosion kind of love affair thing, and all sorts of things were being triggered in my creative brain, and I asked David Bismogus's agent if he would let me adapt it, and he said no. And David Bismogus he's a writer, but he's also a filmmaker, and I think he maybe in his mind wanted to make a movie of another story from the collection. So perhaps that's why he said no. The other part of it is maybe I just hadn't done anything, which would make him believe that I could do it. But I kept asking, and I kept asking like a lot, like every year, and finally, finally, he made a movie from one of the stories, a movie called Natasha, a really wonderful film. And I asked again, and then he said, "Okay, I will let you do it." And I was actually talking to him yesterday about this, but in my version of it, he said he would let me on one condition, which is that I make the story my own and not his, because the stories in the collection are very clearly autobiographical to his life, and in his version of it, he said, "No, no, I was just encouraging you to make it your own. I wasn't, requiring you." But to me, it was it was sort of like the condition on which I could do this. And being a good documentarian, I went up to Toronto, where the story was set and where David is from, and I spent a lot of time with old Russian Jews, and I went to the stores that they went to and bought food that they ate, and I went to shul with them, and I walked in the park when they were walking in the park, and I think I got a very clear sense of what their life was like, and I came home to New York and wrote a script very quickly, and I took one look at it and I hated it. I hated every word of it, and I couldn't understand quite exactly why, because I thought I think I'm pretty observant, and I think I sort of understood these people pretty well, and I went back in my head to what David had said and was like, make the story your own. You have to make the story your own. And there's a line in the story that said, and I'm probably paraphrasing it, but I think he said that Herschel, who's the poet in the film, that his family, he came over about 1950, after the war, and that Itzik, the older man who dies, that Itzik arrived in the same year that the Besmoguses arrived, which was 1979, and I just began in my head to do a little math, I guess, and uh, I was like, well, he came in 1979, and now he's 17. That would be 1986, 87. And I began to think about where I was in my life as a young gay man in New York at that time. And, I spent a lot of time in these bars in the East Village. And of course, it was like the sort of moment of, oh wow, I'm going to come out, and then at the same time there was, like of all the moments to come out, that was the one that was probably the most foreboding, and AIDS very quickly was like a wave that washed over everyone that I knew. So that's really, like once the original character of David in the short story is not gay. And I think once I sort of switched that and sort of made that character more related to my DNA, or at least to share my DNA with the one that was in the short story, I think the script then took a totally different shape pretty quickly.
Yeah, I was fascinated to learn that the story that it's based on doesn't have that particular queer element of the main character being gay,
Yeah.
because that feels like such an integral. I mean, obviously, it's a major part of the film, but also just the sort of juxtaposing or balancing of his two identities as
Yeah.
Jewish and also sort of coming to terms with his sexuality feels like such a beautiful sort of marriage in the film. So that's amazing that you were able to bring that to it. Um, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about um, setting the film in the 1980s. I feel like as filmmakers, or a lot of films that are set in the 1980s tend to have a ton of signifiers of like we're in the 80s now, and people
Very,
have
very
Beatles
Walkmans.
haircuts, and yeah, and this film feels very different than that. I mean, there are small signifiers here and there, and obviously the time period in which it's set is very significant for reasons that you've mentioned. But like, was that something that you were sort of consciously trying to avoid, or what was your sort of relationship to that?
I mean, I think there's a couple of elements to it. One is that I mean, as I said, I think my observational sense is really of a documentarian. I want to see things and I want them to look real. And I sort of know, I mean, I think as a documentarian, you learn very quickly, like when you're interviewing someone or you're in a doing a shoot, either it's going to feel authentic or it's going to feel staged. And as soon as that happens, it's like worthless footage. And so I think, I wanted it to feel authentic. I also had a very limited budget and a super incredibly talented production designer, and so who was incredibly resourceful. And I think we chose we chose a color palette that I think felt of the period. The cinematographer and I were very, gave a lot of thought to the sort of the temperature of the film, and we picked, as you said, we picked things that were um, sort of, I don't want to say subtle because I don't think subtle is really the right word, but I think they were significant signifiers. I think David's jacket was that blue jacket with that fake fur color was so exactly the kind of jacket that, a young kid would have worn. The t-shirts, the sweaters, the old men sort of wore clothes that looked like they had come from thrift store. And part of that was that I think the actual Russians that I met wore clothes that were dated, that they had brought with them, when they came. And so, I mean, Herschel's character probably would have worn the clothes that he still would have worn the clothes he arrived with in the 50s, and the grandfather, was wearing clothes that he brought with him in 1979. And so there were a lot of little things that, like sort of pushed us back. um,
Yeah,
a few cars here and there.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Certainly, like the song choices at the
yeah.
the bar that David goes to, or time
I mean,
appropriate.
I mean, I think music was, that was definitely part of it. I think, I think even the books, like the copies of the books, were the real books that one would, like those would have been the copies of James Baldwin that you could have purchased in 1986 or 1987.
Right.
You know,
Um, Well, speaking a little bit of music, which you just mentioned, but the score of the film, I feel like is such a another really integral part
Yeah,
of the film, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
sure. I mean, I think I'm like the first one to admit I don't really know the music, the language of music in the same way that I do of, say, literature or art or film. And um, so I don't think I have like, I think I have a pretty sophisticated education in one hand and a real weakness in this. And so I mean I think it was good to know that going in, but I had this idea of the clarinet being David's, the voice of David. There was something about it being related to breathing, and I think it has a kind of an edge that goes from being melancholy in one second to being very sort of aggressive almost in the next, and chaotic. And so I did have that idea in my head, and I really didn't. I mean, I honestly did not know much of anything about klezmer music before I. Before I actually started shooting the movie, I went to a klezmer concert, which I thought was great. But after we finished shooting, and we were about a few months, I guess we were about 5 months into, no, can't be that long. It must have been 5 weeks into the edit. I was invited to a concert at Carnegie Hall by one of the actresses in the movie, Eleanor Raisa. She plays Mrs. Greenberg, the sort of girlfriend of the grandfather. And she happens to be a world-class Yiddish singer and musician, among many other things. She's just a really wonderful, brilliant person. But in this concert, David Krakauer and Kathleen Tagg performed, and as soon as he began to play, I was like, this is the sound. And I mean, he is, I believe, probably the world's finest living clarinetist at this point. I mean, it plays across every type of music that there is. And Kathleen, she plays the piano, but she not only does she play the piano, she gets in the piano and plays it. Like she I don't know, she makes it do all these wonderful things with all sorts of other tools that I've never seen anyone else use to play a piano. And so I was like, spellbound by it. And I just wrote. I asked Eleanor, how do I get in touch with them? And I reached out to them, and they had never done a score before, and they were like, we'd love to come and see what you're doing. And they watched the movie, and I mean, like David brought a little clarinet with him, and he assembled it in our tiny little editing suite, and just began playing. And I mean, I adore them. I think they did such a wonderful job with the music.
Yeah, it's such a distinctive, memorable score, and I feel like it works so beautifully for the film. So kudos to
Yeah,
you, even if you're not a trained musician, for knowing
yeah,
what.
I definitely know good music at this
Yeah,
point.
yeah, and
I knew
knowing.
what I didn't want. I knew what I didn't
Yeah.
want. Yeah,
Um, well, I wonder, with a film like this, I mean, it has an amazing ensemble cast. Obviously, Ron Rifkin and a ton of actors who do such beautiful jobs. But it really could have lived or died on this lead performance of David.
hmm,
And Samuel Levine, who plays David, is somewhat well known for The Inheritance, which was a play that was on Broadway and played West End, but hasn't had a lot of film credits to his name so far. But I feel like this is such a wonderful kind of coming out performance for him. And I wonder if you could talk about sort of how you found him and how you knew that he was right for this part.
yeah. Um, so I mean, I think I worked with a wonderful casting director, Susan Shopmaker, who I adore, and she and I mean, I think we sort of understood this movie in the same way from the beginning. And I mean, in some ways, it is a kind of big, juicy part for a young actor, and so I was very lucky that a lot of very very talented young actors came in to audition or sent in tapes and were willing to work with me. And I had never really worked with actors before, and I mean, it is a lot all at once, and everyone was great. I mean, in some way, I think I thought all these actors were really good, and I would bring some back in to do more work with them to see what it was like, sort of working with them. And it went over a couple of weeks, and I kind of narrowed it down to two actors that I really, really liked, but I wasn't totally, totally sold on it. And I mean, I'm sure I could have convinced myself, but Susan said, before we finalize this, we should really go to London. There are some wonderful, really well-trained actors there young actors there that you should meet. And there's this play, The Inheritance, that we should go see. Everyone says it's so spectacular, and it's 7 hours long. And so we went, and we met some other actors, two more actors who I thought were fantastic. One of whom was in The Inheritance, but I met him before we went to see the show. And then there was other actors I was planning to meet after the show, and the play begins. And it's for people who haven't seen it, it begins on sort of an open platform in the middle of a dark theater, and there's a lot of very good-looking young actors sort of draped across the stage, and one actor stands up and begins reading from E.M. Forster, and it is Sam Levine. And I turn, and he reads it, and then he gets a kind of little smile on his face, and he just looked out, and I turned to Susan, and I was like, this, she said, I know, this is this was the journey that we have been on to find him. And as soon as, I mean, I was sold in the first minute, but 7 hours later, there was nobody else. I mean, it's a really tour de force performance in theater, and he plays two characters in the 7-hour epic. And at one point in the second part of the show, both characters are on stage together alone. And instead of doing anything fancy like hopping back and forth, he just somehow, like some sort of acrobat, he just changed on the fly, like from one to the other and back and forth. And it was amazing. I mean, I still, part of me can't believe that he actually, said yes, or that he was still available at the time when we actually, were ready to go. I mean, I kept thinking, he's going to be like gone, like
Yeah.
a star that's gone.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is such an amazing performance and so hard to imagine anyone else in that role but him. It's also an amazing first narrative feature for you. As you said, you've worked in documentary before, but this is your first it's your directorial debut as a narrative filmmaker. Do you have anything in the works now? I know COVID's probably waylaid some plans, but do you have anything?
Do I have anything in the works here?
Oh, yeah.
I'm a very slow and detail-oriented writer, and so it's coming. It's coming. I think the good part about all this, having like the time in COVID to think, is that in some ways, I mean, I think every project, you sort of want to tell yourself, oh, I've done it, I can do it again, and I'll just use what I learned the first time and just do, like take that. And really, I think every script, you have to start from scratch. Like you have to basically relearn who the characters are that you want to use. And for me, I have to fall in love. I really have to be like in love with those characters and know them intimately before I can start. And I have to sort of figure out a lot of different, like the sort of landscape and the sort of character of the place and the time. And but I think I've learned, I learned from Minyan that it does help for me to have like what is part of my DNA on one side, and then something else, like some other piece that I can almost like, I don't know, like when people play tennis against a backboard, like I need to have a surface to rebound my ideas off of and reflect things in different ways so that it creates a kind of, I don't know, like a DNA and RNA strand, like one strand alone probably. Like I don't think I could adapt a script necessarily that I didn't see myself somehow in, or
Right.
a story that I didn't see myself in. But I also know it might be hard just to write about my own life without a frame.
Right. And no, I mean, that makes total sense. Well, whatever you come up with next, we can't wait to see your next project.
Yeah.
But thank you for sharing Minyan with us. We're really
Yeah.
happy that we're able to share it with Philadelphia audiences. And Eric, thank you for taking the time to talk tonight.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
All right. And
Thanks.
thank you everybody else for watching, and hope you all have a good night.